A couple of factors in the scientific revolution. I don't want to go into great detail because I have some readings that cover this issue. One of them that is absolutely critical are translations from Arabic. May sound strange, but during the Dark Ages, much of the learning of Greece and Rome was translated into Arabic and was lost to Europe. From the 11th through the 13th centuries, much of this work was translated from Arabic into Latin. That is to say, original works in Greek and in Latin translated into Arabic, and then from Arabic back into Latin. And as a result, most of what we know about Aristotle and Plato became accessible to Europe beginning in the 11th and through the 13th centuries. And this laid the foundation for a kind of rediscovery or renaissance that I had already talked about. Another factor in the scientific revolution in creating the attitudes that we take for granted in the modern world is something called humanism. I have the definition from Wikipedia, that great source of information on the internet. An outlook or system of thought attracting prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. Remember what I said before, that the new realism involves a focus on the world that we live in and diverting your attention away from the religious and the metaphorical. That's the humanist tradition. Humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, not that we are inherently evil, that we have fallen, we partaken of the sin of knowledge, we've been kicked out of the garden, that we're born with original sin. No, that we are born as blank slates and that we are inherently good. And it emphasizes common human needs and solely rational ways of solving problems. Again, making a new kind of God out of reason and replacing the old religious notions with the reasonable notions that we can concoct by observing the world around us. One of the early humanists that plays an important role in one of the major concepts of this course is Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More was a prominent politician at the time of Henry VIII, ultimately got his head chopped off because he resisted Henry VIII's policies of breaking with the Catholic Church. But at any rate, Sir Thomas More was a supreme example of a humanist who was incredibly curious about the world around him and began thinking about the world in new kinds of ways. In 1516, he wrote a book called Utopia. I discussed this elsewhere in the class, plays a prominent role in this course, but his idea of utopia was a world that was set in the future that would apply new ways of understanding the world based on human reason to create a better civilization and world for all humanity. And he named this, using the Greek root, utopia, which alternatively means either no place or nowhere or an ideal place. It was precisely this new confidence in the ability to understand the world and thus to control and manipulate it that made Sir Thomas More think that, you know what, in the future we are going to have a perfect world because now we have the instruments for controlling it, our reason, and certain methods that will allow us to divine what the world is all about. So it is with Sir Thomas More that the utopian tradition begins. And you might also say the doctrine of progress. That is the notion that we are proceeding from the past, which sucks, to the present, which is getting better, to the future, which is going to be perfect. We're situated now on this timeline moving into the future, and you know what? It's science and technology that's helping us get to a better place. Indeed, inevitably is moving us to a different place. The beginning of the utopian tradition, therefore, is also a reflection of the emergence of this new doctrine of progress. And from here on in, after Sir Thomas More, people begin constructing all sorts of utopias, dreaming about how science and technology will be getting us to a better place, and then looking at the world around them and saying, you know what, we're getting to a better place. Associated with this is what I call the technology utopia nexus. The more we begin to develop machines and mechanisms and ways of understanding that seem to give us control over our environment, the more we dream about future perfect places that we are going to build. As part of this movement from the past into the present and into the better future. I call this the technology utopia nexus, a kind of dialectical relationship between new technologies and new forms of dreaming about better worlds in the future. And then finally, Associated with both of these concepts, a revolution of rising expectations. When your life sucks and you take it for granted that it will always suck, the fact that it sucks is not a problem. If you believe that life is not fated to suck, that in fact it's supposed to get better, you have rising expectations for the present and the future. So if things continue to suck, you now have a problem. That is a very modern idea. It's one that we take for granted, that things should not suck. Therefore, if they do, we have a crisis. We need a solution of some sort. I say this kind of flippantly, but perhaps the solution to the perception of problems in our world is just to accept the fact that things can't get better. If things can't get better, we don't think they will, problem solved. Problem solved. Okay. Critical in the process of developing new, more modern attitudes, of course, is the printing press, which provided a much more effective way to disseminate new forms of knowledge, also to reproduce scientific illustrations and drawings in a way that was far easier than previously. Previously, monks had to have the skill to actually reproduce in their copying elaborate kinds of illustrations, and very often monks just let out the illustrations when they copied manuscripts because they were too difficult. But with the printing press, you mechanize that whole process of reproducing very complex illustrations, and the reproduction is as good as the original, and with very little effort involved. And finally, the voyages of discovery. The movement of Europeans to other places, beginning with the Portuguese and Vasco da Gama in the 1400s, going around the Horn of Africa and into India, and then, of course, Columbus's voyages of discovery, beginning in 1492, and the discovery of the so-called New World. All of this puts European ways of organizing and understanding the world into overdrive, encountering all these new peoples, all these new civilizations, all these new plants and animals. Systems of classification in Europe no longer work, and the Europeans have to develop new ways of categorizing and observing the world in order to take in all these new things that they are seeing. And this is absolutely critical in creating the scientific revolution and in producing a new, more modern mindset. Now, I want to just pause for a second to look at a particular technology that is critical in all of this. Columbus made a mistake when he discovered the New World. He actually thought he had discovered Asia, the short route to Asia. So when he landed in the Caribbean and first made landfall, he thought he was in Japan, and he was actually about 10,000 miles away from where he thought he was. The reason is because Europeans did not have the ability to calculate longitude, that is to say, their point east and west on the globe as they sailed across the seas. They could figure out where they were north-south, but they couldn't figure out where they were east-west. And that had a lot to do with improper measuring mechanisms. So the problem of longitude became a huge problem that was ultimately solved in 1761 with something called a chronometer. I don't want to go into detail about this mechanism, but it involved a very accurate kind of way of measuring time at sea that allowed you to figure out exactly where you were so you wouldn't make Columbus's mistake. The point is that the chronometer enabled Europeans to cross space much more effectively, to figure out where they were, and thus to gain greater control over parts of the world that they could then analyze and study as subject matter for the scientific revolution they were engaging in. They could transform the New World into something that they thought would be amazing. Our Thanksgiving is a tribute, supposedly, to the European ability to organize the New World in a way that the benighted, ignorant, dark savages supposedly could not. Of course, that was bogus, that idea, but the idea behind Thanksgiving, at least initially, was that Europeans coming to the New World, organizing this wildness and these wild people in a new way, and creating this bounty as a result of it. In a sense, getting back to the Garden of Eden, but working our way back through the garden by using our own wits, and in the process, perhaps glorifying God. I want to talk finish up my talk about the New Realism with the figure of Sir Francis Bacon, who lived at the beginning of the 1600s. He died in 1627, and he brings together a number of different threads, pulls together a number of different threads that I've been discussing already in my lecture today. One of them has to do with the printing press. Bacon used the printing press in order to widely disseminate his ideas. Another has to do with contributing to that tradition of utopia building, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the third has to do with creating a method that became the foundation for the way that scientists worked. Many scientists, or natural philosophers as they were called at the time, had been developing these techniques, but it was Bacon who really brought them all together and then suggested a way that scientists could work with each other and with the state. So Sir Francis Bacon, he was Lord Chancellor in Great Britain, and as Lord Chancellor in Great Britain, his job was, among other things, to protect national security. So he was in charge of torture, also a very well-educated person. And there's an interesting kind of connection between his view of torture and the scientific revolution. He believed, sort of like we believed in Guantanamo Bay, or perhaps still do, that torture was the most effective way that you could get knowledge from people who might represent a threat to the state. So he advocated torture as the most effective way of getting at the truth. And you might say he had a similar attitude toward how we develop knowledge about the natural world. You torture Mother Nature into giving up her secrets. And torture in this case means experimentation and test. So for Sir Francis Bacon, there was a kind of analogy between torture to get at truth in the political world and the use of testing and experiments to get at truth about Mother Nature and how the natural world worked. He embedded this idea of test and experimentation, torture so to speak, in his scientific method, or what we today call the scientific method. And the idea is very simple, that you study particular things in the world and gather evidence and data and conduct experiments, and then you use an analysis. After analyzing all this data you've collected, you then draw conclusions about how that particular phenomenon you're studying works, theories about it. Of course, other scientists can engage in experiments and also do a similar sort of thing. And from Bacon's perspective, this is how you advance knowledge of the world, through a process of experimentation, gathering data, and then analyzing that data to come up with general theories about how that particular phenomenon works. Other scientists then confirm and then build upon that knowledge by conducting new experiments to advance the state of understanding of the cosmos, of the world that we live in. Okay. Bacon then wrote a book called New Atlantis, 1620s, which became a bestseller and used, by the way, that printing press that had been invented more than a century earlier in order to broadly disseminate the ideas embedded within this very influential work, which was called New Atlantis. What was New Atlantis? New Atlantis was part of that utopian tradition started by Sir Thomas More that talked about a world based on the application of science and technology. In Bacon's New Atlantis, which by the way was located off the coast of Peru, so where is this new utopian world going to be? It's in those places that the Europeans discovered, the so-called New World. And in that New World, Europeans would be able to essentially operate in a place that they considered to be a blank slate. Never mind the natives and the rest. Genocide was often committed in order to get rid of them and to create the blank slate upon which you could then create this new kind of world. Within New Atlantis, there was an organization called Solomon's House. Solomon's House was basically a model for the modern research institute and university. It contained the scientists who were using Bacon's method to figure out the world around them. The scientists then turned that knowledge over to the politicians, who applied that knowledge to build a better world for the inhabitants of this place, which was called Bensalem, located off of the coast of Peru. Bacon is an illustration, I think, of the powerful sort of way that the scientific revolution inspired the imagination about the future. and confidence about building a better future using science and technology. And it's no accident that there were many people after Bacon who were inspired by New Atlantis to actually go to the New World and apply his ideas directly. In fact, you might say we've been doing that ever since. We're all Baconian. We're all in the business in one way or another of applying our knowledge about the world to build a better future, a new Atlantis, so to speak. So that's the idea of the new realism and how it emerges into certain attitudes that we take for granted in the modern world. In the Renaissance, we see a new attitude that says that, you know what, we can understand the world the way it really is. Not its symbolic, religious significance, but the way it really is. And we can use our wits, our reason, to manipulate and control that world after we understand it to build a better future, thus giving rise to the utopian tradition and to the modern doctrine of progress.